Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present LChayim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub, and there are many individuals in the Jewish world making important contributions to Jewish life today and to the Jewish future. No one is doing more than my special guest on this edition of LChayim. It is an enormous pleasure to welcome to this table Jerry Silverman, President and CEO of JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, perhaps the single most important Jewish organization on the American Jewish scene today. For it's the Jewish federations in more than 150 Jewish communities across America, which literally fund the social institutions and the educational institutions and the welfare institutions, which sustain so much of Jewish life today, and which also help the State of Israel and American Jewry's profound connection to the State of Israel. It's the JFNA as the distribution arm of the American Jewish community, which makes it possible for individual Jews and individual Jewish families like us to effectively support the most crucial and vital institutions of American Jewish life, from the Jewish Family Service to the JCC to day schools and educational programs for Jews of all ages, and for programs that sustain the State of Israel and our connection to Jews throughout the world. And the individual who's doing an absolutely fabulous job of leading JFNA nationally is this man right here, whom I'm proud to call a friend, Jerry Silverman, and thank you so much for joining us at this table.
Well, first of all, Mark, it's a privilege to be here. You run an amazing media outlet and an important outlet for the Jewish people, and we thank you for that.
Thank you.
And it's a privilege.
Well,
it's truly a privilege to be here.
Well, you know, I've grown to love you very much, and I just think you do an extraordinary job, and I know how busy you are, and once a year there's the General Assembly. Not everybody knows about the GA, as we call it, but the General Assembly is the international organization, event, conference for federations, and you know, it's in Baltimore, it's in Washington. Last year you were in Jerusalem, and that takes an awful lot of work, so for you to make time for me right now is very, very sweet of you, and I thank you. I want to talk one moment about you, and then I want to talk about your recent trip to Israel, and if we can, also where you see Jewish life going from the unique vantage point of being with JFNA. But first, you know, we had a chance to speak about this once before, but there may be people who are literally meeting you for the first time now. You had a long and successful career in what's called the business world. And you were with Levi Strauss, you were with Stride Right. You were in extraordinary executive positions there, building companies, marketing, selling, making money. And then Jerry Silverman takes a right-hand turn, leaves the corporate world, and goes into the Jewish nonprofit world. And you begin with the Foundation for Jewish Camps. And now you're with JFNA. Reflect for us. Take yourself back to the days when you got up in the morning, Jerry, and every day you were helping to run a business for profit. What about you makes you willing to give all that up and go into a very, very different line of work? Yes, you're heading a national organization, but it's a very different kind of work. Something drew you. Tell us what.
Well, it's now going back when we had our original discussions, which is 5 years ago, this month, by the way. It's now 10 years.
Amazing.
And going back, and as I've thought about it and reflected upon it, what's really clear is in the private sector, I always think back, what kept me up at night? And what kept me up at night was, are we making the quarter? What customers do we need to spend more time with? Who have we serviced at what level, et cetera? Are the shelves filled? Operationally, are we doing what we need to do? And then what also kept me up at night was my volunteer responsibilities that I would spend time with, primarily with Camp Ramah, New England, at the time, where I was chair of the board, and I also was very active on the national board, as well as with my children's day schools. And so, for me, that kept me up at night. And so when I reflect upon it and I look back and I look at today, what keeps me up at night, for me, the privilege and frankly the honor of waking up in the middle of the night and worrying about elderly Jews in Donetsk in the Ukraine who can't get out, and they're in a war environment, and thinking about the fact, are we doing enough? Is our agency, the JDC, doing enough to get them food? Being in France 2 weeks ago and waking up in the middle of the night 2 nights ago and thinking about conversations we had with young French families, legacy families in France, who basically think about the fact that, they may have 10 or 20 years left to live in France. And to think about, are we doing enough for the Jewish world and beyond as a federation community? And so for me, it's not an either or. It's a choice as I reflect back that for me, it's so much more meaningful and such a purpose to have the responsibility, the accountability, and the privilege to serve the Jewish people than, frankly, it was to worry about the quarter.
I want to push you just one moment. You have a wonderful family, 5 children. Your wife's name is?
Erica.
You built a life for yourself, a world for yourself, a routine for yourself. You don't just one day decide you're leaving Stride Right and walking into Jewish camping. You and Erica must have thought this through. And a lot of what you describe, and you describe it beautifully, I'm so glad you're the one who's worrying about these things. We're very lucky to have you. But you didn't know what you were going to. I can't believe you could have imagined what doing what you're doing now would ever be. And I sometimes wonder to myself, I wonder if Jerry Silverman is having fun. You travel the Jewish world now. You're rubbing shoulders with people who are making an enormous difference in the future of Jewish life in Israel, in Europe, and obviously here in the United States. That's not where you were. And I don't know if you could have ever imagined what that would be like if you didn't start at JFNA, but you have evolved into it. These are not things you thought about when you and Erica have built a world for yourself that was in the corporate world. And what I'm saying, I wanted to hear you talk about how that decision with Erica was made and what drove you then. Not, how privileged you feel now. What drove you then?
Well, both Eric and I come from amazing parents and amazing families.
Yes.
And a decision that we made very early on was that the Jewish identity of our children and making certain that they grew up really understanding the roots of who we are as a people, what our religion was something that we both agreed on 100% and was going to be a significant part of our lives. And so as we evolved and we observed our children and saw how they were transformed, especially with their Jewish camp experience, I told this story 5 years ago about, the first time I dropped my daughter off at a Jewish camp and picked her up 4 weeks later, and an 80-mile drive home where the energy, the exuberance, the excitement about her informal Jewish education, or I would say experiential, so inspired and influenced her. And as we saw how that began to root in our children, I think we knew that it was something that was so important to us, both for today and tomorrow, and that professional step, wasn't such a big step because of how much we were invested in it.
Talk one more moment about the Jewish background that you and Erica bring to your present role as parents and people in the community. Where are you Jewishly?
So we both love being Jewish. We love having a Jewish household. We love Shabbat. Our Friday night dinners with our 5 children, I call them the Fab Five, are monumental. Now when we're together, age 21 to age 20 to 29, it's not easy to get everybody together, but they are just the most memorable days as we think about the growing up years. And building the sukkah. Eric and I were building the sukkah on Sunday morning, and as we were building it, thinking about the years that we had our sukkah, and we had next door neighbors in Newton, Massachusetts, and every first night of sukkah we'd do kiddush and motzi, and then we'd walk through the backyard to the next backyard and into their sukkah. And this was all part of who we were and what we were about. My parents were very Zionistic. My mother, Alav Shalom, she went to go pick out her gravesite in Israel because she wanted a room with a view. And she brought that intensity of Zionism, and Erica brought to our family, just, an amazing sense of roots and steadfastness and discipline in supporting our children's development and their Jewish growth. And, as I would say for you, not knowing but guessing, I married very far above myself. and together it was something that over time has just evolved into something, very special.
I appreciate that so much. There has been a history of how the Jewish Federation world has interacted with the larger Jewish community. And there were times even when there was this classic battle. What's the major address of any given community? Is it the leading synagogue in a community, or is it the Federation? And there was some real rivalry. And a long time ago, Henry Siegman was the head of the Synagogue Council of America. And he asked me to do a study of 5 Federation communities of different sizes to see how the federations and the synagogues in the communities either related to one another, cooperated with one another, understood one another. But the overall image, Jerry, was that the federations were secular, and then the synagogues were, quote, religious, whatever that means in a Jewish context. But that there was a very different sense of who would be involved in federation, what kind of individual in the Jewish community would be involved in the secular. Again, I continue to say I think people are wrong to think you're a fundraiser. You're a fund distributor. Federation is the organization which, if we want to make a contribution to the Jewish world, we don't have to take whatever money we have and divide it into parts. We give it to the Federation, and we know that they will allocate as wisely as they possibly can. But there was at one time this secular notion. Now here, the current president and CEO of JFNA describes this rich connection to Judaism, to Jewish life, to Shabbat, to building a sukkah with your And it is a sea change from what once was the typical image of federation. And I just would love you to sort of reflect from your perspective on how you feel the tone of JFNA has evolved and what it means to you now, and what would you like, people watching right now, JBS Shalom TV, what would you like them to understand about the Jewish character of federation? Do you understand?
Sure. I think it starts with the mission.
Mm-hmm.
And all 153 federations and all our network communities, we have a consistent mission, which is Chesed, Chinuch, and Klal Yisrael.
Was it always that?
I think it was. I don't think it was
It
as
wasn't
pronounced.
Chinuch. I'm sorry, it was not Chinuch. You get a lot of credit for that.
No, that was there before
Chinuch
I came. I can't take
Yes,
credit.
I understand. But you have supported it and pushed it. Chinuch, by the way, means education.
Of course.
So you've got Chesed, this caring for everyone in a
Supporting
Jewish
the most vulnerable
right.
in our
and
society.
Chinuch is education, and the third was
Klal Yisrael.
a sense of Jewish community.
Well, I look at it even in a bigger context. I look at the most vulnerable worldwide. I look at chinuch being bigger than Jewish education. I look at chinuch being the concept of building an educated, vibrant, charismatic Jewish community that's sustainable over time. And think about Klal Yisrael from a sense of our responsibility and connection to the state of Israel, as well as to Jews everywhere. Mm-hmm. And from a sense of the concept of Jewishness, I have the privilege of and real one of the things that I really love and I have fun at is I get to visit communities all over North America. And you see the Jewishness everywhere. Sitting with the Los Angeles Federation, for example, and talking to them with their key rabbis, and listening to the fact that the Los Angeles Federation is supporting their key rabbis studying at the Hartman Institute in Israel in the summer and funding it, ensuring that they're supporting key scholars and influencers to ensure they're enhancing, that they have that ability to enhance their learning and continuous learning. You see that. You see this commitment of Jewishness in their commitment to Jewish learning, both in early childhood, their commitment to this concept of PJ library to young families, ensuring that I think there's 65, 70 federations that are supporting PJ Library, which is a program of the Grinspoon Foundation, which sends Jewish early childhood books to families' homes, over 130,000 homes in America, so that parents can read Jewish stories to their children. And then to early childhood education, to synagogues, to day school. There's the whole early childhood and growth from a point of the journey. But then adult education, you have federations funding adult Jewish learning, from the Maya program that was so strong in Boston and so strong in so many different places, to funding Melton programs, et cetera. And the connection today between federation and synagogue and rabbis is really, really strong. And on the national level, we've created a real chevra of the national rabbinic leaders and real connection to them in our work, from the Aguda to the OU to the RCA to Chabad to across the Young Israel to the Reform movement, to the conservative movement, to the Reconstructionist movement, because we have to have a wide tent and we have to have connections. So I can't tell you what was 10 or 15 years ago. I can tell you what is today and what is tomorrow. Is that federations, we look at ourselves in two ways. One is we have a distinct responsibility and accountability to make a difference in Jewish lives around the world. And I don't know of any other institution that, with our mission, touches the number of Jewish lives that we touch around the world, and with the investment in the philanthropy that allows us to do that. And that's, number one, in being able to do that. And number two, within our communities, really have evolved to think in terms of being the urban planners of Jewish life in a collaborative mode with all the institutions in the community. We don't think in terms of who's number one or who's not number one. It's about the Jewish future. Are we engaging young people, the next generation, this generation, the more senior generation in Jewish life and learning, so that we are certain of having vibrant Jewish communities for the future?
It's thrilling to hear you talk about it. And I'll say it again, I believe the single most important organization, institution of Jewish life in America is the Federation System, the JFNA. And there are a lot of other wonderful, wonderful groups, but you're the umbrella, and you make so much of Jewish life possible. And I appreciate your humility at the same time. You have stood for something that brings this sense of community and chinuch and chesed and Klal Yisrael. So Yasher Koach, and it's just fabulous. And I wanted to say that publicly. And it's interesting. I think you're right. I think that your organization, the Federation System, touches through North America and really then extends, right, more than any other organization does. And I'm very proud, of what we've created here at JBS Shalom TV. And the reality is that for years and years and years, the Jewish world has said, we need to be able to reach more Jews. We need to reach Jews on the margin. How do you reach them? How do you excite them? How do you educate them? How do you inform them? And for one reason or another, Jerry, the Jewish community never used the power of television. And the power of television now goes beyond simply the flat screen TV on a wall. Television is watched in many, many forms. It's watched on tablets. It's watched on computers. It's watched on mobile phones. And it's watched traditionally in the living room, in the den, in the kitchen. And we are now bringing you to hundreds of thousands of viewers, Jewish and not Jewish, who would never have seen you without Shalom TV. And I'm very, very proud of the contribution we're making. And our viewers have been, and you have too, you've been very, very sweet in acknowledging what we're doing. We don't touch what you touch. And so understand that I say it in my own personal congregation every holidays. I say it is unacceptable for there to be any individual in this room who is not on the Federation list giving. I don't care what you give, but Jerry, there are people who spend a lot of money on one night out in New York. You go to the theater now, 2 tickets and parking and a dinner, it's a lot of money. The amount of money people spend on their old cable television bill a month. Just pick something. And how do you not give to the Jewish world at least as much as what you spend on a night out in New York or what you spend on a month on your cable bill? And I would hope people who are watching you understand that if they are not at the moment part of the Federation world, if they're not also supporting all the things that make Jewish life possible through JFNA, hearing you and the vision you describe, they should walk away from this meeting and say, I'm going to make sure I write a check. Anyway, kol hakavod to you. So now we switch gears. This was a very hard summer for the state of Israel. You were there. You went out of your way. And not only that, there were many Federation trips, Federation groups that went. I was reading, again, for my own congregation on the high holidays, some of the extraordinary experiences that American Jews through the Federation world experienced when they went to Israel in support of the Israeli people. But I just want to, I want to open it to simply say to you, you were there this summer. You were there recently. What do you want us to know? What did you experience? What did you see? What did you feel? What do you wish Jew and non-Jew, American, understood about this past summer and where Israel is today. And as we tape, we're just beginning the new Jewish year.
So, the importance of solidarity, the importance of connecting was never so important as it was this summer. Federations nationally, locally, made certain that we had a trip going every week during the 50 days of fighting. Whether it was the UJ Federation of New York, the Jewish Federation of Northern Jersey did a trip, Chicago did a trip, we did 5 or 6 trips. The Reform movement of rabbis went, the conservative movement of rabbis went, the RCA went, the OU went. It was so critical because the media and the news, because of the fact that, the story that they chose to tell was in Gaza versus the story in Israel and what it was like to be under a rain of rockets. And having been through 80 to 90 red alerts, 100 red alerts, was something that is, significant. And I was with a group of 4 mayors, and this says it all, in one session, and I asked the mayors, what can we do as diaspora Jews? What do your communities need most? How can we be helpful?
Where was this?
This was in the South. All 4 were southern mayors. And one woman mayor got up and she said, Jerry, what I most need right now after 4 red alerts last night, as a mayor trying to help people, she says, what I need most right now is a hug. And she says, I need that symbolically and I need that for my own sense of support. She said, because your group being here and other groups being here, showed that through these nights that we're dealing with, that we're truly not alone, as a country, as a Jewish people, and knowing that there's a bigger, broader Jewish people out there supporting us is significant. And having been in Sderot, probably, which is on the border of Gaza, having been there probably 8, 9 times this summer alone, Sderot, which over the last 10, 11 years, 12 years, has had 12,000 rockets aimed at them. Think of the children of Sderot. And the mayor of Sderot, his daughter, 16, is an artist. His daughter painted a picture of her view and understanding of what the children of Sderot have gone through over the last 10 years. That's the children of the South. That is the,
You understand, that picture is never seen on American television.
No.
And I don't mean simply that literal picture. It represents something enormous.
Okay.
She captured the pain, the anguish. And people don't understand. I'm telling you something, everybody was upset there weren't more Israeli casualties. There were too many Palestinian casualties, none of Israeli casualties. As if because Israelis weren't dying, whatever Israel was doing in Gaza was unfair and immoral and brutal. I can imagine what it would be like to be in a synagogue or in the Kaufman Auditorium at the 92nd Street Y, and all of a sudden the siren goes off, and we know that somewhere on the Upper East Side, not necessarily Lexington and 92nd, but somewhere on the East Side, a rocket is going to fall, and what panic there would have been in the Kaufman Auditorium or in a synagogue or in a grocery store. And I know that every young family that cares about their children, they would do everything they can to spare their child that. And this went on, Jerry, this reign of rocket terror went on for children, not day after day, not week after week, month after month. And the world seemed to say, well, what's the big deal? And what should Israel do or not do? What's fair? What is an appropriate response? And one of the things I did want to ask you, and it's interesting to hear the stories you tell, and this hug, very important notion. And, that's what you were there doing, and that's what all the people that you described. But I also wanted to know how you felt. How do you assess when you hear well-meaning American Jews say, yes, I understand that Israel was living under a horrible situation, but did they have to kill Palestinian children? Did they have to, rain down carnage on hospitals and UN buildings what was your sense, and what would you say now in terms of the context of the way in which well-meaning American Jews seemed to feel that Israel had gone too far and had crossed a line and were doing something immoral, and that the war, therefore, has created a certain kind of problem? It's not about public relations. It's a problem of connection between a certain portion of the American Jewish community and the state of Israel. Speak to that for me.
So, to me, it's about education, and it's about really getting out factually and having dialogue with as many people as possible about the reality of the situation. Because the media told one story and one side of the story. And the media also was somewhat sequestered and quieted out of fear by what the terrorists would allow them to put out and not put out. And so you're dealing with one side. And so when I have been talking to various groups, various individuals about this, I really talk about two sides of the situation. One side of the situation, which is Palestinian people that are truly held hostage by a terrorist organization. Hostage. The minute there was a ceasefire, people who in any way complained, and in any way, shape, or form, tried to create noise about, why did you spend 50 days shooting rockets? Look at our homes. The first day, 20 people were murdered doing that. There's a terrorist organization that has a stranglehold on the community. I talked to them about the people of Kibbutz Niram and the fact that they told us that before Hamas went into Gaza, they were in direct communication with the Palestinians. They're literally across, and not as far as you and I are at this table is how far Kibbutz Niram is to Gaza, to the Gaza border. And they were having interchanges and sharing information on farming and agriculture and how best to evolve, and on different types of health. How do you deal with health, and how do you deal with emergent care, and what can you do to really create a beautiful Gaza city? And there was all kinds of joint programs going on between the Palestinians in Gaza and those communities, kibbutzim and municipalities that were on the border. There was over 100 programs that were in process. The Hamas came in and shut it off and shut it down. Shut down any possibility of that city flourishing like any other community. And so I talked to them about the fact that when you have a terrorist organization, not dissimilar to any other terrorist organization, that has basically taken captive an entire population, I said, you have that on one side. Then you have a country that, what would you want the U.S. to do? If there was someone across their border digging tunnels and sending terrorists with hypodermic needles and handcuffs and grenades and submachine guns that only want to kill and kidnap into your backyard, into your dining hall, into your home, what would you want the U.S. to do to handle that? I said, I'm not really certain in any war that I know of between two countries where one country calls civilians on their cell phones to say, we know there's terrorist ammunitions, or there's terrorist factories, or there's rocket launchers in the vicinity of your home. Please leave. We do not want to harm you. Tell me, and we talk about these things. And we talk about them, try to talk about them in a pragmatic way. Mm-hmm. So the facts are on the table. And the fact that, let's go to the beginning of how this started. Hamas, which is now very clear, kidnapped 3 boys, murdered them, and at the same time started shooting rockets at Israel to the point where there was no return. So let's start at the beginning of who started this. Let's go to the fact that there was 11 attempts at a ceasefire during the 50 days. Every time the prime minister, in some cases, it was not politically correct, agreed to a ceasefire, but every time Hamas would violate the ceasefire. And so let's just go through all the facts of this situation. Is it horrible that innocent children and civilians were killed? Yes. You never want to see. But I would share with you that Israel did everything humanly possible to ensure that they minimized casualties as best they could, given the fact that they were under a rain of rockets, and they were under a situation where 32 tunnels were dug, into their land, with the sole purpose of murder and kidnap. And once you go through that with people, I'm finding they're having more open to listening and understanding, and the opportunity for them to espouse the truth.
One of the things that I was most proud of was that, on Shalom TV, we tried to be the balance to what was being seen on American media. And we were, every single day, we were doing programming, and you went out of your way again. We spoke with you when you were in Israel.
Correct.
And we spoke to a number of Federation people, but you were there on the ground, and you're talking to America on Shalom TV, and I thought it was critical. And the response we got from the audience was very, very appreciative. But what you've described is what I wish everybody understood, and you're doing it in your way. And here we have there's one place on American television where Israelis can speak in their own voice, and the story could be heard. I heard one person said it in a way that really grabbed me. If there was a child, a Palestinian child, a Gazan child, and I saw this child, I would do everything I can not to shoot at that child, hurt that child, with one exception. If somebody were standing behind that child shooting at my child, if somebody's shooting at my child, I don't have a right, I have a responsibility to try as best I can not to hit the Palestinian child, but to do whatever I need to do to stop the Palestinian or Hamas or whatever from shooting at my child. And that, in essence, was what the State of Israel was up against. The State of Israel, as you pointed out, went to heroic, unparalleled steps to try to avoid needless Palestinian casualties. And it's very hard if the other side doesn't wear uniforms to know really who is a civilian and who is not. I have pointed out many times that whether you watched MSNBC, CNN, Fox, doesn't matter, all of the networks, there was never a visual of a man, of a Hamas terrorist dead in the street. We never saw him shoot a gun, and we never saw him dead. We only saw women and children either dead or screaming. And I don't minimize that. But I also said, Jerry, any day in those 50 days that Hamas wanted this to end, and they wanted their women and children and men to be safe, all they had to do was stop firing the rockets.
But the fact is they didn't want it to end.
That's right.
They didn't want it to end because, A, they were desperate. You know, on the one side they had Egypt closing the tunnels. On the other side they had Israel. They were desperate to create a unity government and realized that they had lost any type of panache as a terrorist organization and were losing. And their only way to come out of it, you know, was to attack Israel. And it was complete desperation. And they didn't want it to end. Mm-hmm. And that's the sadness, you know, of all of it. You know, the one thing is you talk about them not wearing uniforms. In fact, they did wear uniforms because when the terrorists, if you remember, infiltrated through the Mediterranean Sea and came out near a kibbutz and took off their wetsuits, they were wearing Israeli uniforms. And at first, when you look at the video, Israel was hesitant to fire on them because they weren't certain within the first 30 seconds, because they were wearing Israeli uniforms. And that's another important fact and important strategy of terrorism they used.
And the story isn't told. We don't hear this on network television. We don't read about it in the New York Times. And we didn't hear journalists telling us that they were intimidated into not telling the whole story, and that only some very small stringers who didn't understand were the ones who began to get out the story, that ultimately people were being literally threatened with death if they showed certain things or told certain things. To me, it was a betrayal of American journalism that NBC wasn't telling America, we can't show you because we have to protect our people, but understand this is what's going on. And if that would have put them into danger, then they should have pulled every one of their reporters out and not had the visuals. So all the things you say are very important for our audience to hear, and it puts it in a much different context. It's all about context. War is horrible.
For sure.
It is horrible, and nobody wants to kill somebody else. We don't want to kill Israelis. We don't want to kill Palestinians. No. But if the alternative is you are killed, then the Jewish tradition makes it clear you have a responsibility. You can't sacrifice yourself. It's against Jewish law, against Jewish values, against Jewish principles. You have a responsibility to protect yourself and defend yourself. You said you spoke, for example, to mayors, and you were in Sderot. And how many? You said you went 5 times in this.
I made 5 trips
How
this summer.
exhausting! But it was very important that Jerry Silverman was there and who you represented. Did you ever have an opportunity to speak with members of the Israeli government? And
Yes.
And everybody should understand. There's certain things that you are told in a private conversation. It would be inappropriate for you to come on national television and say. But there are certain things you can tell us. I want to know tone. I want to know anything you can tell us about what you heard from whatever, as high a level as you got. Bring us into the room to the extent to which you're able to, and give us a feel.
So it was fascinating this summer. For the most part, in conversations with varying members of Knesset, ministers, and government, and even with the U.S. ambassador to Israel, Dan Shapiro. The conversations, the unity of the government during this conflict, the dialogue with people from the opposition party, like Isaac Herzog, to various members of the Prime Minister's office, to Bennett's office, across the board. There was such unity about being together in this conflict. It was beyond what we've ever seen before in any conflict, because remember, this was the longest conflict that Israel has had since 1948 in number of days. And the government and the government leaders spread out. When I would go visit soldiers who were wounded in Barzilai Hospital, I would see Knesset members there. No cameras. They were there because it was in their heart to be there. When I went to Soroka Hospital in Beersheba, I ran into other members of Knesset and saw them there visiting the soldiers. When I went into the South, which was every trip, whether it was in Shar HaNegev, whether it was in Sderot, whether it was in Ashdod, didn't matter. We ran into people because they also realized that they needed to connect and show their support of the people of the South who were under this reign of fire. So the unity to me was unbelievable, and I truly believe that it all stemmed from the example that the families of the 3 boys set.
Ayal, Naftali, and Gilad.
Those
the 3 teenagers who were kidnapped on the West Bank and then murdered.
Correct. I think that set the tone for the way that government officials really pulled themselves together.
Describe the tone.
During
what
the war.
Moved you about them? And they were extraordinary. But what moved you?
What moved me was the fact, and I met with them a number of times. I met with the 3 families during the time the boys were allegedly or assumed kidnapped, where we had conversations with them where they said, we don't know what the chances are, but we're going to hope. And are we doing enough? Do we need to come to America to meet with people and to influence? And we were actually discussing the morning that they found out. We were actually on the phone with Israel with them, talking about a trip to the United States. But they were going to be hopeful. They weren't going to be angry and blame.
Yes.
They were going
not
to
hateful. They were not hateful.
They could not believe the outpouring of love that came from around the world. The unbelievable understanding as they found out the vigils that took place, the rallies that took place, the amount of Tehillim that was read around this world for their three boys.
Psalms, right.
And what they said point blank is, our boys in this horrible, horrific situation, that the people of the world and the Jewish people have come together across every boundary around this. And after their boys died and were buried, we had spent quite a bit of time with Gilad's parents, Ophir and Bat Galim Shair. We went with them to their son's grave the night before the Shloshim ceremony at the Great Synagogue. And they said that night that these three boys who were buried side by side by side in this cemetery near Modin, they said, it's horrific that they died, but their memories are going to live through this concept of unity, through this concept of love of the Jewish people that came out, and we are going to keep that alive. And this tone of unity we saw through the government, we saw it through officials, and it was almost an underlying theme throughout, because when you went through the South during the war, there were massive amounts of food, where people from all over the country were bringing food to the border to make sure that all the soldiers were fed, these heroes. Outside of Beersheba, there was a big barbecue pit that was going every single day to make sure that there was ribs and meat and chicken and things like that for these boys. The whole country unified, as did the world. The hundreds of thousands of Jews that came together for rallies across every stream of Judaism, and non-Jews alike, was unbelievable. I had the most amazing conversation with Mike Huckabee in Israel during this time. And his belief and commitment that this tone needed to pervade, across and be timeless. So that's the tone that I heard and saw throughout these 50 days.
Take 1 minute. Sometimes I say to a guest, tell me what concerns you about the Jewish future and what you're hopeful about. You're a very optimistic, positive person. On a different time, I'll ask you what concerns you. What at the moment, 60 seconds, gives you the most hope in the Jewish future when you hear all of the doomsday prophets telling us the young generation doesn't care about Israel, philanthropic spending and the donations in the Jewish community are down, Federation has all kinds of there's a disconnect between a large portion of American Jewry and the state of Israel. But you live it in a different way. 60 seconds. What gives you the most hope, and where do you see the most positive of the Jewish future?
So, in two different areas, I see incredible hope. I see hope in our next generation. With all the doomsday predictions, I look at all the different programs and engagement that's going on across communities, whether it's in New York, with the Moish houses that have been opened up and funded through federations, whether it's the Roots program in Los Angeles or the IACT program on campuses in New England, whether it's the Next Gen in Detroit, whether it's Birthright, whether it's a new program called Onward to encourage young adults to do internships in Israel for the summer, to connect. The amount of inventiveness and creativity that's happening, that's engaging the next generation, gives me hope. Seeing an Onward alum be on campus, which is a very volatile climate today, on Ohio University that has had issues, and seeing, based on her summer, speak to that is spectacular. Seeing a young woman who went on a birthright trip who became an activist on the University of Michigan campus, taking her learning and her emotional connection and becoming an activist in her own way, however she practices Judaism, but it's in her heart and soul. I become excited. And on the second front, I look at two things. One is the amount of Jewish learning that is going on using the tools of today, whether it be online, whether it be through various means, Daf Yomi learning on the one hand, to all kinds of experiential learning that's going on, to what you're doing, which is so, so critical to have this media outlet, which educates us, is so critical. And I saw all that come together this summer, because the outpouring of connection and love I saw from the diaspora Jewish community to the state of Israel, to the anti-Semitism that's going on in different countries, and to the Jewish people of the Ukraine, says to me, it's not doomsday. There truly is significant opportunities in front of us. And we have our work cut out for us, but it's there.
You will continue to lead us in extraordinary ways, from strength to strength, Jerry Silverman. You are fabulous. I love you very much. Kol tuva hatzlacha. You just keep doing what you're doing, and the Jewish future will be bright. And I thank you for sitting here, but more than that, I thank you for the contribution you've made to Jewish life.
Thank you, my friend, and I love you too, and I love what you're doing for the Jewish people.
Thank you very much.
We can't tell you how much we appreciate it.
Thank you, Jerry. Jerry Silverman, President and CEO of JFNA, the Jewish Federations of North America, an extraordinary Jewish leader. You've got to know him here a little bit better. You must come back again, and we'll talk more. Yes?
Anytime, sir.
Okay. As always, I invite you to be in touch with me with any thoughts or comments you may have to anything that Jerry said on this edition of LChayim. Please email me, write me, post on our Facebook wall, tweet me. I love your tweets. I look forward to hearing from many of you. Until the next time, I'm Mark Golub. LChayim, my friends, to life.
LChayim is a presentation of Jewish education in media.